So, I'd like to get this presentation started by asking a quick question. Who here would still like to be the President of the United States? I'm seeing a lot of hands, and that's good, because getting elected to public office is the easiest thing in the world. Absolutely anybody can do it these days. Getting elected and winning any kind of electoral campaign, be it for a presidency, parliament, or even just student council, is a mix between a science and an art. There's an incredible amount of research that has gone into what exactly makes a campaign successful, and there are many different elements to it. There's the narrative you're able to construct around your candidate. There's your positions on the issues, your advertising. There's an incredible amount of things that come together to form a successful political campaign. But there's one thing that a lot of people don't think about, that when it's done right, can have an absolutely phenomenal effect on the success or failure of a presidential or any kind of political campaign. And that is field organizing. Field organizing, if it's done right, has the potential to completely disrupt a political campaign and an electoral race for a candidate. It has an incredibly powerful impact on increasing your candidate's vote share, and the first European political party who's able to take the lessons of American-style field organizing and apply them to elections here in Europe is going to have an incredibly powerful new tool at their disposal. But before I get into a little bit about what field organizing actually is, who am I? My name is Thomas Gilroy. I have 4 years of experience working in field campaigns for major electoral races in the United States. My first race was working for Christine Quinn's admittedly unsuccessful run for mayor in New York City. And my most recent race was I was lucky enough to work in 5 states for Bernie Sanders' presidential primary campaign, including working as part of the teams behind his upset wins in New Hampshire and Michigan. I've seen firsthand what kind of powerful effects a well-run field program can have. And today, I'd like to share a little bit of those secrets and a little bit of my experience with you. So, right off the bat, what exactly is field organizing? Field organizing is a way of motivating what's called direct voter contact, as in having one-on-one interactions with actual voters, usually either over the phone or through direct door-to-door canvassing, or going out and knocking doors. Canvassing and field organizing is a very unique science to it. There's a mix between actual hard data and the utilization of numbers and information you get on the field, and a certain je ne sais quoi of actual in-person interaction that is incredibly important to defining a successful interaction with a voter in the field. But when you're looking at the overall design of how a field program works, there are 3 main stages: identify, persuade, and get out the votes. Now, in the first stage, identifying, is when you're actually going out there and defining your voter universe. So let's say that I'm running in a presidential primary campaign. The people in, let's say, New York State. The only people who can vote in this primary are registered members of the Democratic Party. So it only makes sense for me to want to talk to registered members of the Democratic Party. Well, back in the day, if you wanted to go out and knock on doors and have a good conversation with voters, or have your volunteers or your canvassers do that, you literally would have to go to every single door, or at the very least the door of every single registered Democrat, which obviously is going to be incredibly labor-intensive and a waste of resources. But in 2008, Barack Obama's presidential campaign completely upended the game when it comes to field organizing in a way that many people attribute his victory in the primary and the general election to, through the introduction and the mass use of a tool called VAN, or the Voter Activation Network. The Voter Activation Network is, to put it very simply, a proprietary piece of information and a proprietary information storing system that allows the Democratic Party to build voter profiles and both information about millions of voters across the country. And using that information, we can create and define a fantastically detailed voter information profile. So let's say we're doing that same kind of primary election. We don't want to talk to every single Democrat. We only want to talk to the Democrats who have a history of coming out and voting in elections. We only want to talk to Democrats who have proven that they have had good interactions with canvassers in the past. And we only want to interact with Democrats who are very involved in the political system. Being able to use this data to narrow down your information and your target universe is incredibly, incredibly important. And once you have that narrowed down, you actually send canvassers out to identify the voters you want to talk to. At this phase, you're really doing more of a survey than anything else. Literally going out, finding out if people have been thinking about the election, what candidates they're supporting, if they're supporting one at all, how they feel about it, and very importantly, what issues are incredibly important to them. Using all of this information, you're able to build a better idea of your voting universe, and having a good, solid base of information gathered during the identifying stage is the absolute foundation of a successful field campaign, namely during the second phase, persuasion. During the persuasion phase, you are going out and literally persuading people. Having identified a huge, or hopefully a huge number of voters who are on the fence, maybe who haven't made up their mind, during the persuasion stage is during when you contact these people for the second time, with your objective being largely to persuade them to come out and vote for your candidate. This is usually what most people think of when they think of door-to-door canvassing, so I'm not going to explain it in too much detail. But the persuasion phase is incredibly important for the simple reason that this is when you actually get people on your side. So a well-run persuasion campaign being staffed by well-trained volunteers and field staff is incredibly, incredibly important to make sure that the message of your candidate is being brought to voters in a way that's clear, concise, and most importantly, relevant to their lives. And finally, we have the single most important phase of all three of these, GOTV, or get out the vote. These are 4 letters that strike fear into the hearts of anyone who's ever worked on a political campaign. Because in the 4 days before the election, it is all hands on deck time, making sure you reach out as much as possible to people you have already contacted. You see, even if you have a good conversation with somebody at a door, it means that they're much more likely to actually turn out and vote. But you need to kind of go back and double check with them and reinforce the importance of them going out and voting. At the same time, there's people within your party's base who you know are reliable voters, so you didn't necessarily need to persuade them, but you need to go to them to make sure that they're coming out and voting in the election. GOTV is very different in the approach you have to take towards people at the door. Namely that at this phase, you're just making sure they get that last little push or maybe doing a few tune-ups on their support rather than trying to get them on board with your team. During GOTV, for example, there's a lot of psychology involved. For example, if I'm at the door during GOTV, my approach to someone would be to have a friendly conversation with them, ask them when they're planning on going out and voting, and trying to find out a little bit more about that so I can build a vote plan with them. To the effect of quite literally at the end of our conversation being able to say, all right, Mr. Smith, so you're going to go to your local polling place, you of course have to tell them where it is, at 9 o'clock in the morning to go out and vote for candidate X in the upcoming primary election. Literally just saying this direct order to them, or not really an order, but laying out the details for them, can have an incredibly impactful response on whether or not they actually turn out and vote. GOTV is essential to make sure, quite literally, that you get out the vote and get souls to the polls. Without a well-run GOTV program, you're going to see the labor you invested in the persuasion and identifying stage go completely to waste. So how effective can field campaigns really be? Yale University in 2015 did a fairly in-depth study to do exactly this, and what they found out was shocking. What they found is that when it comes to political persuasion, the medium is the message, to quote Marshall McLuhan. Impersonal means of contact, robocalls, mailers, things like that, mass emails, have a negligible impact on whether or not people come out and vote at all. So the money campaigns are spending on that is essentially useless. Television and radio advertising can have an impact, but it usually only has an impact of between 3 and 5%, and that impact fades over time. And in situations where the voting population is saturated with ads and with political advertisements, meaning every single election ever, that impact falls to between 2% and 0.5%. So the incredible amounts of money that are being poured into television and radio advertising aren't being used well. But a well-run field campaign can, in the right situations, lead to a more than 40% increase in somebody's likelihood to actually go out and vote for your candidates. Different studies have found different amounts, but in a well-run campaign, with a well-run field campaign, you can expect your total vote share to go up by between 5 and 10%, depending on what study you're asking for. So it is obvious that field organizing, literally just having this direct person-to-person conversation about the issues of the election, can have an incredibly impactful result on your success in the election. So the big question is, why don't more campaigns do it? And the reason why, even though it is vastly more cost-effective, is that it is a lot of work to put together a well-constructed field campaign. Not only is it labor and time-intensive, but you need a lot of specialized organizers who know what they're doing, can effectively train volunteers and paid canvassers, and who can build the infrastructure and data collection network you need to have a well-run field program. There have been attempts to bring it over to Europe before, namely during the Brexit campaign, but without the kind of intense infrastructure that needs to be developed over time, it can be a little difficult to do so. But if you are able to construct that, it can be insanely effective. A well-run field campaign can turn the tides in an election, but at the same time, a poorly run field campaign can absolutely undermine your campaign's success. And to illustrate this, I'd like to take a minute to talk a little bit about the 2016 presidential election. Now, by a show of hands, who here legitimately thought that Hillary Clinton was going to win the election? I know I certainly did. And the problem with that is that a lot of Clinton's team thought the exact same thing. Now, as a caveat, I was not on the Clinton team. I am not speaking from firsthand experience. But as the months have gone on, a clear picture has started to emerge of what happened inside of the Clinton campaign, leading to the surprise defeats, specifically within Michigan and Wisconsin. Now, there's a much larger conversation to be had about other potential failures, but within the two specific states of Michigan and Wisconsin, weakness in Hillary Clinton's field program proved to be a fatal flaw that very well may have cost her the election in those states. Now, based on the research and based on the information that's been coming out, it looked like there were two failures that happened in Hillary Clinton's field program: a structural and strategic failure, and then a failure of data. In addressing the structural and strategic failure, this is a very rough matrix that illustrates the kind of populations you reach out to during your field campaign. Of course, up here you have partisanship, and over here you have how often people actually come out and vote. Now, during your campaign, over here, D, swing voters who always vote are your absolute #1 priority. Reason being, these people are going to vote no matter what. So every single one of these people who doesn't vote for you is going to certainly be a vote for your opponent. So these voters are absolutely the gold standard of people you need to be reaching out to. Beyond that are swing voters who sometimes vote. For the same exact reason, they have a high chance of voting and could go either way, but they need just a little extra push. So these folks you'd want to make sure you reach out to again during GOTV. And then over here in C and E, you have the traditional Democratic base, or I'm using Democratic, but you have the base. As in, these are the folks who over here always vote Democratic and always vote, so you really don't need to worry that much about reaching out to these people because they're safe votes. But over here, Democratic people who always vote Democratic, but only sometimes vote. These are exactly the kind of people you need to be reaching out to during GOTV, for the simple reason that if you make sure these people get to the polls, then that's an extra vote in your pocket. This is the conventional logic that a lot of campaigns use in order to build their field programs. The only problem is the Clinton campaign thought that because of the unique situations of the 2016 election and how much of a, let's say, unique candidate Donald Trump was, they had an opportunity to change this game. What they assumed in states that they thought were safe, like Michigan and Wisconsin, was that a lot of the voters in this area over here actually were in C. The reason being that they thought that Donald Trump's brash personality and the highly visible nature of this election cycle meant that a lot of voters would turn out no matter what, and that they could not, and so as a result of that, they didn't need to dedicate time and resources to getting out the votes of the Democratic base here. At the same time, in states like Pennsylvania, they had the bright idea that because of the, as I said, brash personality of Donald Trump, a lot of centrist Republican voters who always go out and vote, but always vote for Republicans, could be persuaded to abandon the Republicans and vote for Secretary Clinton over Donald Trump. So they thought that they could poach voters from here in the always vote Republican column. There's one small problem with that, though, is that people who always vote Republican always vote Republican. There's a great quote from Senator Chuck Schumer, who's now the most powerful Democrat in the United States Senate, that for every one voter we lose in the Rust Belt, we're going to gain 2 in the wealthy Philadelphia suburbs. The only problem with that is that these voters who they reached out to, who are Republicans, still went out and voted for Trump. When you look at actual vote totals, particularly in swing states, Donald Trump didn't have some huge upswell in voters. He actually had about as many voters as other Republican candidates have in the past. The Republican base turned out for Donald Trump, but because they weren't reached out to enough, the Democratic base failed to turn out for Hillary Clinton. That's why, from a strategic level, this really is not so much an election that Donald Trump won through some grand political strategy, but it's one that the Clinton team lost by making assumptions about the Democratic base. Beyond that, though, there's another level of failure, a data failure on the part of the Clinton campaign. Earlier on, I talked about how important it was to build your identification network and to create a robust network of voter profiles. But the Clinton campaign thought in the same way that through the introduction of VAN, the Obama campaign revolutionized how campaigns are run. The Clinton campaign thought they could take it a step further. In a lot of states, particularly in states they thought were safe, now they did have a more robust, more traditional field organization in states they thought were going to be competitive, but in safe states, they thought that they'd found a way to game the system. Instead of doing traditional three-step identification, what they did instead was they bought huge amounts of advertising metadata and used that to construct an ideal voter profile. Their thought was using the same kind of information that allows advertisers to target you based on your Facebook likes and things like that to deliver targeted advertisements, they thought they could construct a voter profile and voter data information base from the exact same bits of information. So let's say, for example, they find out people who earn more than $80,000 a year, watch certain TV shows, and have a college education are more likely to vote for Secretary Clinton than Donald Trump. They would assume that these people are in their column, and in doing so, they could save themselves an incredible amount of time and labor. And it is a really, really good idea, except for one problem. Their data was wrong. There are reports coming out from states like Michigan specifically is in this case, where some canvassers were going out and 40% of the people they were reaching out to who were supposed to be in the Democratic base were actually strong Trump voters. Not only was the campaign dedicating resources to this data-based approach and not turning out their own voters, but they were actually increasing their opponent's vote share by getting out those candidates. And at the same time, when field organizers started reporting back to campaign headquarters in Brooklyn that they were seeing vast discrepancies between conditions on the ground and the data they were told, the data they were given, the campaign's response was that they were wrong and to trust the data instead of what they were seeing on the ground. And as a result of that, a lot of the field operations were not as well staffed and weren't as well resourced as they needed to be. There are even some accounts of volunteers trying to go to Michigan to knock doors for the campaign and being told to turn around and go home because the campaign thought that if the Trump campaign saw more Clinton volunteers going to Michigan, they would increase their spending in Michigan, which would lead to an arms race. So their reliance on the data that was wrong ended up costing them big time in the election. This is just proof that when it comes to field organizing, you can't beat actual hard work and field organizing. You can't try to game the system, and at least for now, there's only so far you can push it. Real, well-done organizing is the only thing that can actually make a field campaign work. And I'd like to talk just very briefly about what happens when a field campaign is run well. Now, as I said, I did work for Bernie Sanders, and I am a little bit personally biased, but this is what happens when you have a field campaign run well. In early 2016 and late 2015, nobody knew who Bernie Sanders was. But because of the virtual tie in the Iowa caucuses and his outstanding win in New Hampshire, Bernie Sanders splashed onto the national consciousness. The reason he was able to do as well as he did in Iowa and New Hampshire is that in both campaigns, he had professional, well-trained and intelligent field programs out there. The impact that those field programs had on turning out voters in those two specific states is hard to overstate. And in other states, for example, in Michigan, where I worked, as well as in New Hampshire, the same exact thing happened. Everybody said Bernie was going to lose, but because the campaign took a strong field-first organizing approach, he was able to win what was, at least until that November, one of the biggest political upsets in recent political history. And also, I just love this photo because if it wasn't cropped so much, I would be right there. when it's done right, field can have an incredible amount of impact on a campaign and completely change the game in an electoral race. The first European political party who's able to take the lessons of American-style field organizing and apply them to their races is going to have an incredibly powerful tool at their disposal. So the big question is, which party will be it? And will you take the steps to make sure that your political party motivates their leaders to engage with field organizing in order to construct more sustainable, more comprehensive, and long-term relationships with voters that can lead to a huge impact on voter turnout for the next century of European politics? Thank you very much.